So today I'm going to talk about some of the work. It's really kind of a conglomeration of the research that probably about the last 5 years. And so right now I actually have a really cool human subject with kids with CP. 4 years ago it was just robots with no kids. And so I'm going to talk to you about this research that's done primarily with my clinicians and some clinics in Georgia that I work with. So to lay the foundation first in terms of the mode solution. So children with disabilities, and this is not just cerebral palsy, but it's primarily any disability. Typically intervention, which is you're working with an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, a speech-language pathologist, intervention is necessary. And the earlier you can diagnose a child, the better off. Because they show, like we mentioned, repetition, repetition, repetition. And so typically when a clinician works with a child, they have to play. There's various reasons. And so play is the fundamental job of the child. Children are actually conditioned to understand play in order to explore the world. And so when you're doing therapy with a child, it really is providing an experience of play, and then you cater it towards an intervention. Whatever you want them to keep on doing, you would cater it. And so for a large number of reasons, mainly because you need a lot of repetition. Typically, you don't have that dedicated service of a therapist and a child that is put together to give you that dedicated repetition. They are looking for alternatives. Typically, this whole concept of at-home care, and they're really looking at this. And so there's various interventions that are coming out, and I'm going to talk about primarily robotics because I think it is the one. It is not the only one, but for our purposes, it is the one. And so what are the challenges for robotics? And this is really for any of the technologies. One challenge is for the clinical world, the therapy world, for the medical world, it's about efficacy. It's about, here's a robot, it's good, it's nice. It doesn't actually function the way that I want. And does it function robustly? Does it function in terms of testing and retesting and reliability? It really isn't just oh, it worked for this one child and we're done. It really is, as roboticists, we have to prove over many, many kids, over many, many days, over many, many months, that this actually is efficacious for this interaction. Which is, as roboticists, that's very hard to do because we're typically paid to do the research and the fundamentals. And we'll do a few human subject trials, but getting into that next stage, we're typically not here. And so my students are learning how to do this long-term deployment. The other thing in terms of the technology is you have a clinician who is very excited about robotics, but they're not programmers technically, they're not engineers. And so how do you allow a clinician to really interact with the robot in terms of saying or providing the clinical objectives? When you're in the home, how do you have the child interact with the robot and vice versa? And then how do you bring this kind of continuity of care? The robot now has to report back to the clinician. And so there's all these different factions, and you have different individuals the robot has to interact with. The clinician, the child, the clinician, and there is a parent somewhere in the loop. And so I'm going to talk about target demographic, work with children with cerebral palsy, wide range, typically 6 to 12 years is the age range, and even in that age range, a large variation. And again, it's about play. It's about providing an environment, therapy environment that institutes play. And so robots are perfect for this. First of all, children are excited about robotics in general. It doesn't matter if you're typical, neurotypical, you have a developmental disability, you have a physical disability. Children are fascinated by robotics. And so we don't have to work about, is it going to be engaging? Is the child going to listen to the robot? We already have this set the stage. We don't have to try to force that, which is nice. That's one thing we can check off our box. And so it is already situated as a play kind of situation. And so we always mention it as the robot playmate. It's a clinical platform, but it is a robot playmate. And so again, repetition, repetition, repetition. Robots are really good with this. If it's a very static environment, exceptionally good at this. In a dynamic environment, we have to do a little bit more development in order for that to work. But it really is about repetition, repetition. Now, some of the challenges on the human side is that children in general, and the reason why clinicians will use this play type of environment, is that children are actually conditioned to pay attention. They're conditioned to listen. So us sitting in this room, focused on email or focused on our presentation, this is a conditioned behavior. When you're born, when you're 3, it's not that you have ants in your pants, you're actually not conditioned yet. In terms of your neural processes, you have to learn how to pay attention. And so this can be challenging if you're in an environment where you have to grab the attention of the child and understand that when the child deviates, how do you re-engage the child again in order to bring them back into the intervention section? As a clinician, even a special ed teacher, they know how to do this. They are magical about re-engaging the child. How do we do that for the robotic system? How do we, one, recognize that the child has been disengaged, and two, re-engage the child? So this is some of the aspects of getting the robot to actually be an intervention protocol for the child. The other thing is that there's a large variation in what the movement profile is of the child. And so I have here two kids. On your left is a child who's considered fairly mild. And so in the clinical world, they have a scale from 1 to 5. So one is a child with cerebral palsy who does not need a walker, has maybe a slight limp. If you notice them, you might not even notice that they have a disability, but they do. One is they do have some issues with attention in terms of long walks. They still need some assistance with that, their motivation. So there's various characteristics of even a child who's mild because they still have an anomaly in the brain. They still have some mappings that are missing. To a child who's severe, so this would be severe spasticity, very little control of their muscle movements, very, very extreme. And so we really would like to design robotics that can fill the entire gap. Of course, this is the dream. And reality is that each child is different. And so we have to really think about different solutions for the different target demographics. But this is what we're dealing with, the extreme aspects. Also coupled with the fact that there's also differences in cognitive ability. A 12-year-old child might not be cognitively thinking or at the level of a 12-year-old typical child. A 12-year-old child may be cognitively of a 3-year-old age. So how do you also put that into the equation? So the objective overall is how do you design a system that's interactive and child-friendly? So this deals with the aspects of engagement, how do you re-engage your child, how do you do things like social interaction, aspects such as that. We need things that the clinician can understand. So metrics that are quantifiable, reliable, and also in the language of the clinician. We can't go back and say, look at this data, it's really good, look at my curves and wiggles. Yes, the child is doing well. It has to be in the language of the clinician. What is your range of motion? What is your path length? What is your jerkiness? These are the things that we have to convert, and we can calculate them, but converting it into the language that the clinician understands so that they will choose to adopt this. And then, of course, has to address the variations that you find in these children, both the cognitive aspects as well as the movement profiles. So, our robot playmates, and some of it, I'll show some movies in it. Some of it's early work, some of it's learning work, some of it's just I put up there and it actually didn't work. Again, we're here now where I show you all the cool stuff, but there was a lot of lessons learned going through the process of what works in the lab doesn't necessarily work when you're in the real world, in the wild, in a child's home. And so, again, it's about play, it's about repetition, it's about re-engaging the child. One of our this was back in the very, very first studies, is we used the Clio, we hacked the Clio. If you remember, that was like all the rage. You would buy a Clio and you would hack it. And so what we wanted to do, some of the therapy that these kids go through is called constraint-based movement therapy, which is basically, if you think about your dominant hand, you typically use it and then you have your weaker hand. So a child with CP, they're just the same. They have a dominant hand and an involved side. So the involved side is the one that typically has the anomaly, right, left kind of thing. And so what they typically, a really effective form of therapy, although it's kind of brutal, is you take your involved side, you let it free, you take your dominant side, the one that is your lifesaver, and you basically strap it down, and you have to go. It's like you go throughout your week using your involved side. And what does this do? It's like you want to eat, you have to figure out how to move that involved side. You want to do something, you want to play, you have to figure out how you use that involved side. So it's a way of doing repetition, forced repetition. You have to use it. And I think it's kind of brutal. But it works. That's the thing. It's effective. Adults, stroke, beautiful. Kids, it's effective, but it's definitely not engaging. Here they are, they're already struggling. And now you're like, oh, and by the way, we're going to make it very uncomfortable for you to interact with your friends. And so typically, constraint is, in terms of the scale, it's 1 to 3. And the severe, this doesn't work. And so what we wanted to do is we actually started robot programming camps. And so what they had to do was we have to nunchuck, and they had to actually use their involved side to program the robot with different movements. And so what we tried to do is what we try to do is basically provide a motivating factor in order for them to use their involved side. And we had competition and things like that. So that was some of our first motivation. So if you think about play, this is more of the theory behind it. If you think about a robot, you think about a robot playing, and what is it that you want from this engagement, this protocol, is first off, we have to understand this concept of what is play, what is the definition of play, how do you map it, how do you represent it, because we need to understand that concept of play in order to then replicate it and program the robot or have the robot learn this. And so these aspects of what is the definition of play, which links to movement profiles, the definition of what is turn taking. If I'm interacting with a child, when should I actually put in the protocol versus just having exploratory curiosity, letting the child lead the play versus the robot lead the play? When do you switch? And a lot of this comes from a motivation from the clinical. If you're in an environment where you have a child and a clinician, typically the process is the clinician will have the child work at that level, which is basically, it's like Disneyland in a lot of these places. They sit in, the child comes in, and it's all these toys. And the clinician lets the child choose what they would like to use, choose their movements, and work that. And then what the clinician does is they lead them to the direction. So if they have to work on hand-eye coordination, but they're not interested in that, they're just interested in the tablet, they'll let them stay in the tablet, and then therapists will interrupt and say, oh, I just saw you touch that circle. I have some circles over here. Why don't you come in and show me how to do the same thing in the physical world? And so that's what the clinician does. So we have to do these things with the robots. And so things we use is, so we learn what play is by doing observations, looking at kids interact, looking at YouTube videos as well as live demonstrations, observations of kids in their homes, and we've come up with a database of what play is. And so when we have our robot system in the home, we actually look at the child, see what they're doing, we map it to our database and say what they're doing is they're doing a sorting, or they're doing a stacking, or they're doing exploratory play, which is basically, we don't know what they're doing because it's not in our database, so that's how we're going to label it. And so with this kind of database and this interaction, we can now recognize what it is. And so what we did was just said, you know what, we're not going to necessarily model it from the very beginning, we're just going to learn from the data that's out there. And so we have this database, and we use this database to then come up with structures of, what is the sequence of operations that a child does. So if you're stacking, for example, what does that look like? Just you grab a toy and you put it on top of it. So very rule-based. And then what we have, we also use this observation to then have the clinician communicate to the robot. And so when we have a protocol, what is it that you want to do? We basically do the same thing that we did in terms of learning what play was. We have the clinician say, well, this is what a protocol is. If I want the child to do large to small, or I want the child to do hand-eye coordination with the left hand versus the right hand, what is it that I want to do? The clinician basically just does it. We store that, does it a few times, we store that information, and that becomes I'm looking for a match of this, or I want to drive the child to do this or something similar to this. And then, of course, we need to extract the metrics. And so, extracting the metrics, we actually have two methods. Like most people, we also use the Connect, but we also use that hardcore vision with two eyes, which is brutal. So we have two approaches. Connect actually works better when we can use it, but our two eyes method. And so what we do is we extract the movement. So we look at where the arm is going. We look, in fact, we don't track actually the arm. We track the object that's in the arm, and then we make some assumptions about what is the kinematic chain of the human body. And so if an object is this, and I have my kinematic chain, where would the actual shoulder be and the elbow be? Things like that. And from that, we then extract things like range of motion, jerkiness, path length, speed profiles, and things that the clinician needs. So we all put it together, and then we have robots that interact with these kids. And so this is actually some early work where we were looking at using music. We're still looking at music, but music as an interaction tool for not only ensuring that the movement is matched to a certain profile, but again, just like robots are naturally engaging the kids, music is too. And so again, it's something that we don't have to force. We add in music, we put in a robotic system. So in this regard, we had the child had to interact with their robot in order to play some, it was like like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, Row 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 Your Boat, some very painfully, artistically challenged things. So, there's some videos because I'm running out of time. So we've done some studies where we have robots. So what's nice about the iPad for older kids, so this is typically the 10 to 12, is that a lot of the clinicians, what they use is that there's a bunch of different types of apps, therapy apps that require the child to either move, have aspects of, I have a smaller object put into a larger object. And so we've done some work where we've interacted and had a robot interact with a child where the therapy apps are actually on the tablet. And so we've done a couple of experiments with that. We've also done some experiments where we've taken out the robot, because one of the things we always get is, what's the reason for the robot? Robots are so expensive, why do I need the robot? We have virtual reality, why don't you just have a robot avatar? And so you get all of these kinds of, not from everybody, but you have some of this pushback. And so as roboticists, we need to explain when robots are good and when they're not, when they're valid and when they're not. And so we also do studies on virtual reality systems to see, where do they break and where do they fail? And some interesting studies have come out with that. So this is some of our studies. And so here's an example of one of our kids playing. We can extract, just like a robot system, these values, these kinematic metrics for evaluation for different children. And all these children are mild. She's 1, my next child is 2. And so again, it involves side. And what happens is we also compare them with typical kids. And so what's interesting is you look at the data and the data doesn't lie. Like with the physical eye, you might say, well, I don't see this. But when you look at the data doesn't lie. You'll see the profile of a typical kid, and there's a profile. And you see a child anywhere on the spectrum, and they are a deviation from that typical child. And so it's amazing that I'm not even trained, but you can look at the data. And then lastly, what we do is we still run a bunch of robot camps for children with disabilities. We design curriculum, we design interfaces for even severe kids, so children who are not all the way to 5, but on the 3 to 4 level where they can interact and program robots. And so we continue to do about 1 to 2 a year, about 4 to 5 kids in camp, again, wide variation. And so this I really enjoy because it's not we're going to have you as a study and you might or might not benefit, please sign, please have your parents sign. But for all of our kids, we also do these camps so that not only are we possibly providing some impact on the physical world, we're also providing some impact on the education area. So this is more of a behind the passion because I believe that is also necessary. A lot of these kids, they're like locked in. They're so smart and so inquisitive and yet don't have the access to express it. And so with that, I'm done. We're still in human subjects. We're actually in long-term deployments. Long-term is 8 weeks, which is actually not long in terms of the clinical world, but for robotics, it's like super long. And like more than once, every day for 8 weeks. And nothing so far has broken, so far. And we're also doing some work at-risk infants where we're designing robotic systems that can actually do interventions for preemies all the way up to before. So this is before walking age. We're starting to do some observations now and some robotic. So they don't move, but the infant has to do something in order for the robot to do something. Thank you for all my clinicians and therapists and my students and postdocs, and I am done.
Thank you, that was a great talk. I really admire the work you do. I had a couple of questions for our last first round. You were talking about how you make these assumptions, you actually also
Yes.
make the assumptions based on this. My roommate in college, TAMU college, had cerebral palsy, and the way her arms move was actually very different.
Yes.
But it also seemed like they don't all have the same differences. So I was just curious how you incorporate that.
So what we've done is we've come up with, so in the clinical world, typically they create a baseline. So and it's kind of difficult, but especially for kids. So there's a typical baseline, which means that they take a bunch of kids. In fact, our baseline is about 50 kids that we've actually established a baseline.
Okay.
And so when we're modeling and tracking, we're really just looking at the extremes from the baseline. That's how we do it. And so we can't necessarily say that they're at 5. We just know that given the typical norm, their range of profile or their path is way beyond.
Well, that's a lot of fun.
I have a question. Do you find that there's a age or severity range that these interventions work best for, like as far as, I know you want to do the whole thing,
Right.
but where they work well now?
So where is 2 and 3. We work well now and at a cognitive age of 6 and up. So under 6, not doing, and again, these are kids who physically might be older than 6, but cognitively are not. I won't say they don't pay attention, but basically they don't follow the rules at all. So that's hard.